President Muhammadu Buhari arriving in Mogador International Airport in Marrakesh for the 22nd conference of the parties COP22 on climate change. He was received by a high-powered Moroccan government delegation. Also among them were delegates from Nigeria. Hello and welcome to Giant Strides, a special program that highlights efforts of government in making Nigeria's economy stronger and more competitive. On this edition, focus is on Nigeria's participation at the 22nd session of the Conference of the Parties COP22, organized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was held in Marrakesh, Morocco. I am OKON. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change entered into force on the 4th of November 2016. As a result of this, the first session of the Conference of the Parties was held in Marrakesh, Morocco, where world leaders deliberated on the way forward. At the opening ceremony, Mr. Salahuddin Mezzour, who doubles as the president of COP22 and Morocco's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, called on advanced world powers to take responsibility for the effects of climate change.
We have to all be ready for this world challenge and not disappoint the hopes of vulnerable populations. Did we not learn anything from the African proverb that says, the sun does not ignore a village just because it's small?
Following COP21 held in Paris, France, which ended with the landmark Paris Agreement, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP22 held in Marrakesh, Morocco, signals the new international regime of cooperation on climate change for the transformation of economies around the world. Like other member countries, the Nigerian delegates brainstormed on the scope which the deliberation and ratification of the Paris Agreement will take. Dr. Peter Tarfa is the Director, Department of Climate Change in Nigeria's Federal Ministry of Environment.
It's a roadmap on what to do to tackle issues of climate change. Nigeria has quietly keyed into it. Mr. President is in the forefront, he has signed it. So we are going there as part of the global community to discuss further on how to implement the Paris Agreement.
Nigeria is committed to an economic transformation which places inclusive green growth at its heart. The country's renewed urgency comes from the recognition of the grave social, economic and environmental threats that climate change poses to Nigeria. Amina Mohammed is Nigeria's Minister of the Environment.
Nigeria's ambitions are quite high. We want to empower people, we want to take climate action, we want to protect the environment, and in each of those we do use an entry point as the NDC. It's ambitious. We've got what we want to do unconditionally, and we will do that. But to bend the curve, the conditional will be a big part of it, and that means what are our partners willing to do? Africa, Nigeria, least responsible for the predicament that we're in today vis-a-vis climate change, and yet we carry the burden. And so really I think the onus is on our partners to see those commitments they made in Paris, how do they translate them into real actions and make sure that they can move the investments which are available. We proved that in Addis as we discussed financing for development, that the money is there, but we need the keys to unlock it, and are we prepared to partner to do that?
President Muhammadu Buhari has said that part of Nigeria's efforts at tackling climate change, which has become a menace to the whole world, is the increased use of climate-smart agriculture, diversification of energy mix, working to end gas flaring, and implementing cleanup of Ogoni land in Rivers State, southern Nigeria.
Determination for green growth in my country's ambitious intended national determined contribution. We have also announced our plans to reduce emission by 20% by the year 2030, with the intention of raising this target to 45% with the support of the international community. This is one of Africa's most ambitious intended national determined contributions, convening all emissions from all parts of the economy.
The special advisor to the president on media and publicity, Femi Adesina, said the president and delegates used the opportunity to rally international support for the revival of the Lake Chad Basin.
President Muhammadu Buhari has shown deep and great commitment to issues of climate change because it affects us directly in Nigeria and it affects the whole world. Like it is said, there's no planet B. This is the only planet we have. So if we don't keep it, we don't tend it, we don't preserve it, then the planet will grow old and die. And when the planet dies, where do we live? You will recall that last year at COP21 in Paris, he made strong statements about the need to preserve the planet and as it concerns us in Africa, particularly the Lake Chad. It is expected that he will advance on that same issue.
Nigeria is experiencing adverse climate conditions with negative impacts on the welfare of millions of her people. Persistent droughts and flooding of seasonal rains and dry spells have sent planting season out of orbit in a country dependent on rain for agriculture. The result is fewer water supplies for use in agriculture, hydropower generation and other uses. Mr. Samuel Adejari, a former Director, Department of Climate Change, Federal Ministry of Environment, alerted the Nigerian delegation on areas to seek foreign assistance.
There are other climate change agreements that are being implemented and being discussed at this conference of parties. But when it comes into taking decision, as far as Paris Agreement is concerned, we may not have, much say because we have not become a party to it. And it is very, very important that we just find a way of doing that.
Climate change is a global challenge and as such requires a global approach. This has informed the negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The developed countries are required to take the lead in the fight against climate change and offer support to developing countries. Mr. Desmond Majikodumi is an environmentalist.
One of the mitigating measures, it's actually adaptation and mitigation of climate change. You have the climate change, one of the ways of slowing it down is to put these huge, big green walls. And we have this project right across that zone of Africa.
African leaders called for speedy action for the implementation of the commitments made at the COP21 in Paris and urged the fulfillment of the pledges of the G7 to provide the financial resources for electricity to millions of Africans. African leaders met at a separate summit in an effort to reach agreement on key climate issues and present a common voice. The goal is to combine African efforts at fighting climate change and to build a sustainable, clean energy future. Amina Mohammed, Nigeria's Minister for Environment, represented President Buhari at the Africa Day at COP22.
We have prepared an NDC implementation roadmap. It details roles and responsibilities around mitigation, adaptation, monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions and putting in place our governance structure. We are ensuring full ownership of and commitment to the NDC by the relevant ministries, departments and agencies. This multi-sectoral collaboration is crucial to delivering results on the pledges and essential to mobilizing international support for our effort. We are also exploring options for mobilizing finance and investment. Further, we will continue to engage the private sector, an important partner in sustainable development, and development partners for their continued support. In spite of the global downturn and our own budgetary constraints domestically, we are committing a reasonable part of our 2017 capital budget to this effort. The 2017 budget will be a green budget that will reflect Nigeria's efforts to realize our NDC. In addition, we are set to launch our first ever sovereign green bond in the first quarter of 2017. This is intended to fund a series of projects targeted at reducing emissions for a greener economy and embedded in our NDC.
Climate challenges facing Africa dominated this year's UN climate talks in Morocco. According to Nimo Bassi, an environmental justice advocate in Nigeria, Africa has the wisdom and knowledge. He is of the opinion that communities in Africa are loaded with activities that cool the planet.
The notion of having an African Day at the climate conference is very important because really the COP is about looking for solutions, but from listening to the negotiations, we don't think they're looking the right direction. Our indigenous system of farming is very organic. There are people who work with nature, they don't work against nature. They don't use toxic chemicals. People are against genetically modified organisms. So Focus on Africa would help our negotiators and our governments to look at really what are the very terrible things that are coming to the continent.
Africa was on the forefront of the fight against global warming at the COP22 in Morocco. In view of this, the African Development Bank created a pavilion where people met, talked and negotiated. It was also an opportunity for the 54 African countries to be heard and defend their interests. If you must know, Africa contributes very little to the planet's greenhouse emissions, as little as 3%. Yet, the continent is one of the primary victims of the consequences. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President, Africa Development Bank, AFDB, speaks on the role of the bank in helping Africa to finance part of the cost fighting climate change.
We all know that Africa is the least emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. It doesn't account for more than 2%. But Africa suffers disproportionately from the negative impact of that climate change. You can see it all the way from the droughts that we now have in East and Southern Africa, which is basically decimating all the livelihoods of people. And so there's Africa, which has been shortchanged by climate change, must never be shortchanged again by climate finance. So I think COP22 is very important to get the climate finance right for Africa. It is fundamental.
Today on Giant Strides, we looked at Nigeria's participation at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the 22nd session of the Conference of the Parties, COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco. The program was co-produced by UCHECHI UGWUZOR and ALIU Ibrahim SALIU. The studio manager has been Emmanuel Kolade, and from Voice of Nigeria, I am Eno Ukun.